All right, welcome to a brand new episode of the Jake Blanchard podcast. I'm here with Tom Murphy, and I'm excited that you've decided to join me on the show today, sir.
Yeah, man. Thanks. I appreciate you, Jake.
Dude, you are obviously you're in a hotel room. For those who are listening, I get the background of Tom. He's in a hotel room somewhere. Tom, where are you at? What you doing, man?
I'm in California today. I'm in just outside of Camp Pendleton, San Clemente, and I'm in a hotel room. It's the story of my life. I spend about 200 days a year right now in a hotel. Well, not right now, since 2014. So this is my life living in a hotel. But I came out here, crazy story. I don't even know if we'll get into it, but just spent the last 2 days with about 250 Marines in the infantry. And it's just kind of a wild story. And I still don't know how to process what just happened to me over the last 2 days here. It's crazy.
Well, man,
that's where I'm at.
Dude, I love it, and I've been looking forward to having you on the show to the last couple of weeks, doing some research on you, your background. I'm really interested in kind of the ecosystem that you've put together with Sweethearts and Heroes, and some of the things that you're out there doing, impacting lives, and those types of things. Why don't we just dive into that right away? Like let's just get to the, what is Tom doing right now, and like what does that ecosystem look like?
Yeah, man, it's a happy little accident, as the great Bob Ross would say. Didn't intend this. The universe had it ordained. I told you I was from Philadelphia, and I've told this story before. I actually just started telling it a couple of years ago. I didn't talk much about it, but my parents ran a mission home. They used to literally take people off the streets of Philadelphia. And we didn't have a lot of money, man. In 1979, my dad told me a couple of years ago he made $8,000 and 3 kids, my mom, and we always had people living with us. And I spent most of my weekends going to prison, visit my brothers and sisters growing up. And I could just tell you story after story, man. Tough stuff. And that's when it started, Sweethearts and Heroes. And, I was a struggling learner, like massively. Like you never met my academic equal. I got a 630 or 640 on my SATs. You probably got that on one half of your SATs, Jake.
There's some truth to that. Yeah.
I didn't care about school, but I was programmed to wrestle. My dad and I, from the time I could remember, him on his knees every single night. As I got older, we would break beds and smash walls. And you talk to my mom, she'd be like, it was a disaster. And, but I was just programmed to put my hands on people. I don't know what it was. It was just, that's my significance. And, I moved to New York when I was about 10. My parents kept it going, had people shipped from Philadelphia to New York. Kind of weird. You didn't talk about it as a middle school or high school. You homeless people living in your barn that was converted into some apartments. And, but I found the sport of wrestling, and it just changed my life forever. And fell in love with wrestling. My wrestling coach never really wrestled. I had about 7 or 8 kids on my team. Was small team. I shouldn't have defied any odds because my dad didn't know how to wrestle. My coach wasn't really a wrestler. I just didn't know how to lose. And I thought I was going to wrestle the rest of my life. Time for college came. I was a pretty decent wrestler. I entered the state finals at 37-0. And
wow.
I just didn't know how to lose. I wasn't good on my feet. I couldn't take many people down. I just was scrappy. And I thought I was going to wrestle, but my grades were so bad that the story is like, will make you believe in cosmic forces, how I got into college. Anyway, I did get in, went to a school called Brockport in Western New York. My coach was a guy named Don Murray. Was an Olympic coach in the 76. And I think it was 76. Really a interesting guy. You waited for him to die every day because he was such a monster, but I wouldn't be who I am today without him.
Yeah.
Last year, he was the longest reigning NCAA coach, 51 years. A legend.
Wow.
And yeah. And, but I fell in love with education in school. And I went in there as on special talent, left with almost a perfect GPA in psychology and philosophy. And I wasn't ready to stop wrestling. I'll wrap this up so you can jump in. I wasn't ready to stop wrestling. So when I got out of school, I was on my way to Chicago to graduate school. I got involved in the rail industry for the summer, fell in love with that. I happened to get stationed put in St. Albans, Vermont, and met Julio Fernandez. And, this was in 2001, something like that, a long time ago.
Yeah.
A buddy of mine was doing some jujitsu. And, I came off a national championship team. I was runner up in the country. And I'm like, I'm going to go show these jujitsu guys. Man, I got choked 6 ways from Sunday. Man. And I just got fascinated with it. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I could take any one of them down, but you put that kimono on, they grab a hold of your neck, and you're like,
Yeah.
did I really just tap? And I just fell in love with it. And I've never, I mean, I like to compete, but I'm a training junkie. Like, I just love to train. And so I didn't care if I ever competed again. It was my outlet. I had a wonderful career, man. I had some men that wrapped their arms around me in business. I worked for a guy that took our company from a $500 million to a $2 billion company, worked for Fortress. And I just became one of his disciples. And he mentored me. And so I didn't care if I ever competed. And, I found myself just training with Julio. He was connected to Carlson Gracie, like the father of mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
And he retired from Carlson's team undefeated with over 200 kimono matches. And I got to know Carlson, went back and forth to Chicago, trained with him. Stephan Bonner was on The Ultimate Fighter, God rest his soul.
That was recent.
And and I never watched Ultimate Fighter 1. I mean, I was into the UFC, but it was early, but I was just busy working. I was having a family. I had 4 kids at the time, little kids. And so I'm not a smart guy, Jake. But I do know I have an instinct to protect my family.
Yeah.
And it's an ancient instinct that I was programmed with as well. So I wasn't going to do anything stupid, and I was making really, really solid money. But I could play both roles. I could continue to train and work out and strangle people and fun stuff like that. And then I found my this Ultimate Fighter 1 came out. My sister applied me to the show. I'm like, Kristen, I didn't even watch the thing. And I can't believe I didn't watch it.
Did you have any amateur mixed martial arts fights?
I had a little bit, man. I had a little bit. I did some stuff. Carlson asked me to. I fought in a couple places, and he came and actually cornered for me once. That was kind of cool. I never told anyone that. He actually in Atlantic City, he flew in to corner me once, and it was pretty cool. It was
an honor.
Carlson Gracie. Like, I didn't know what that meant at the time.
Yeah, right.
And then I started going back and forth to Chicago, trained with Stephan a bunch, with Miguel Torres and those guys. And I found myself, it's kind of a sad part of the story, and it's a little heartbreaking to me. I'm still friends with Julio, but, and I don't know if I should say this, but I'm gonna, it's just the way it is. Julio and I kind of, we parted ways. I mean, he cornered for me at UFC 58. And, Dan Gable had one of the greatest dynasties in wrestling for one reason, just one. He was a great wrestler, but there's been a lot of great wrestlers, technicians, but he put a bunch of animals in a cage and had them tear each other to shreds. Now, my coach in college, I never learned one thing from, not one wrestling move. He took a bunch of animals, put them together, and we tore each other apart, and he let us do it. And we became tough. We became animals. And I just knew that model. And I was wrestling in Burlington, Vermont, doing jiu-jitsu with one of the greatest on planet Earth. Julio, a couple of years ago, got his coral belt. Wow. One of the only people on planet Earth to have a coral belt. And he's still teaching jiu-jitsu today. I mean, I love the guy with all my heart. And but after I did the Ultimate Fighter show, which is a whole another great long story. Anyway, after I did that, I got to Rich Franklin and I became really good friends. And I spent years, because we had a railroad office in Cincinnati, and I just spent years going back and forth, training with him and George and a lot of those guys. And again, just to fill my need to train. And I really wasn't thinking much about competing. But I knew that I couldn't stay at Julio's, because Julio's, it's the jiu-jitsu school. And, it's Burlington, Vermont. There's no animals in Burlington, Vermont.
I've been to Burlington quite a few times.
Have you?
Yeah, no, it's a cool spot, man. In a
previous life,
UVM was a client of mine, so I used to find my way
really?
Burlington and hit up Ben and Jerry's and drop
Oh,
over into
shoot.
Stowe and hit
Yeah.
that nice fall drive down to Boston, through
Yeah.
New Hampshire. Like it's a beautiful spot. But to your point, small area
It is.
and maybe geographically limited as far as sets and reps that you need at a professional level.
Yeah. 100, there's only 600,000 people in the whole state of Vermont.
Right.
So this is really interesting. It was interesting for me. So I just secretly, because I know Julio's mindset in Brazil on Carlson's team, you never crossed lines. You train with your team, and that's it. And so I started sneaking up to Montreal and started training with these Muay Thai guys because I knew in college I wasn't a good wrestler on my feet. I dominate people on my feet today wrestling. It's the only place I want to be because they just trained me that if you're going to be a champion, you got to win on your feet in wrestling. That's it. That's what the Olympics is about. So I started sneaking up to Montreal, found this Muay Thai gym, started training with those guys, was in UFC 58, and pretty neat story there too. But anyway, so um, George came on the scene, St. Pierre.
Yeah.
And he fought at UFC 58. He fought BJ Penn. It was BJ's comeback fight. And I didn't have any connection there, but I knew George was in Montreal and he's lined up for a title shot. So I reached, he was training with this guy named Victor, and it was his coach. And so I just went to TriStar. I'm like, I'm just going to go one day. So I went. And doesn't this guy make a beeline for me? Dude, I can see this in my mind. This was 15, 18 years ago. And TriStar was like half the size. And this guy makes a beeline for me, this darker skinned, darker haired guy. And I was like, hey, I'm here to train. And some other guy was talking to me. He's like, do you train? And I just fought in UFC 58. And I'm like, yeah, I train a little bit. And, you know, I didn't want to parade anything around, but this guy makes a beeline for me. And he's like, he walks right up to me, gets right in my face. He goes, I know who you are. He said, you're welcome here. And shook my hand. It was Firas Zahabi.
Whoa.
And truth be told, and Firas would tell you this if you talk to him, I was one of Firas's first students. He wasn't George's coach. He just sat in the back chair. He cornered against me at UFC 58. If you watch the tape,
that's how I knew you.
Yeah, that's how he knew me. It was crazy. But Firas became one of the most important people in my life. I spent about 8 years traveling back and forth, training with those guys before George was a champ. It was me, this guy, Harry, Marcus, that Firas took under his wing, and he started his own little team. Like I was his first teammate, me. And he just would train us on Saturday mornings. He wasn't with George. George was still with Victor. And then that kind of dissolved, and Firas's magic just stuck out, and George aligned himself with Firas. And this was before Danaher, all those guys. And so we just started training. We had about 10 or 15 guys that would train. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't glamorous. And that became my home. TriStar became my home. But really, I spent more time going to TriStar because most people don't know this about Firas Zahabi. He is one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met on planet Earth. And I'm not even talking about his fight IQ. He can talk philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Epictetus, anything you can imagine, Firas can talk it. And I would spend more time after practice goading him in to talk to me about philosophy than about mixed martial. I didn't care about mixed martial arts.
You had a degree in philosophy then. I mean,
a minor. Yeah. But his degree is in philosophy, and he's just freaking brilliant the way he thinks. He thinks just he's a disruptor on his thought process. And you're like, dang, I never thought about it like that. And so we would just talk philosophy, but I would train. I'd go up there a couple of days a week, and I did it for years. And he's actually the one, you know, when I fought in UFC 58, I was lined up to fight Jake O'Brien in 72 in Belfast. We were on the main card, and I was going to be Murphy and O'Brien. This was before he fought Arlovsky. And I had like $7,000 worth of plane tickets, and a week before, and I just started at TriStar. Like Firas was not with George at the time. I just started TriStar, and it's crazy, man. I haven't thought about this in years, Jake. I was not planning on talking about this kind of stuff.
I'm just letting you go.
Yeah, man. I'll wrap it up.
No.
But yeah, anyway, Jake O'Brien hurts his neck and pulls out of the fight. And last minute, nobody's ever heard me say that before. Just pulls out. I talked to Joe Silva. They try and make another fight. But Faraz actually stopped me because I was terrible on my feet. Not terrible. I mean, I could hold my own, but I was never trained properly on my feet. And Faraz had been working with me. And he's so great because no matter what your style is, he doesn't force you into a traditional style. He adapts your style, because I'm a right-handed guy, but I fight left-handed. I fought one fight right-handed, one, Rashad Evans, because I tore my MCL the first week of the show. And I don't even talk about that because I never want to make an excuse. Never
Yeah.
mentioned it on the show. I had surgery 2 days after I fought Rashad. And the guy that did Chuck's knee, Dr. Sanders, told me, he's like, you tore your MCL and you got to have surgery. So you either go home or pull out or fight. And so I told Matt Hughes, I'm like, dude, I got to fight next because, and that wasn't on camera. I'm like, I got to fight next because I can't even train, dude.
Yeah.
It's that bad. And so, anyway, that's all. But for us, I'm just digressing. Sorry, I jumped.
No. You're all good.
But anyway, so but for us, it's just great. And I just fell in love with the guy, man. And, I still talk to him today. The TriStar just became my home. George became a really good friend of mine and, took me under his wing too. And I remember when he fought Koscheck one time, this is the kind of, I talk to young people all the time. Sometimes the ones that know who George is, because it's funny because kids don't even know who he is today. Yeah. But I say he's a champion for one reason. Dude, this is incredible. We would train at our height with 50, 60 guys every week. The pro sparring. George St. Pierre comes in. He's so funny, man, because he he used to carry like a rollerboard suitcase. Here comes George. He doesn't have like a gym bag. He's like a rollerboard suitcase. And he would come in and, and it's funny when you train with at TriStar at that time, the pro sparring was 5 rounds. And if you made the board, Frost would take his top, 20 guys, make like 10 matchups, and you do every round. It's Tom and David Loazo, Tom. And so if you made the board, you were one of his guys. And I made the board every time. And every week he'd give me 1 round with George. So I was one of the guys that got 1 round with George every week. And because he liked my wrestling and he wanted me to, and it was heavier than George, and he wanted me to, really push him on the wrestling side. And where the heck was I going with this? Dude, I'm lost in so many memories that I wasn't even thinking. I thought we were going to talk about kids and stuff, but what was I? I was saying something. It had a really good point and meaning. But,
you're saying George St. Pierre is a champion.
Why he's a champion? Why I tell kids? But it has nothing to do for me with George's mixed martial arts prowess. George is the champ. He comes into the gym, man. He would greet every single person. Hey, man, how you doing? Thanks for coming. Even if you didn't work with him, thanks for coming. We would get done training, and George and I would, a lot of times we'd stay after and lift together, just him and I, like everybody else would be leaving. But he would thank everybody for coming, shake their hand, gratitude, appreciation. Yeah. I mean, here's a guy that's making 7 figures. He ain't got to do that. It just really, one of the most beautiful things I learned from George was the gratefulness that he had for the men, the women that would show up and help each other.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a champion. And it's funny because I'm out here in California, right? I'm sorry, I got to go on this quick little tangent.
Let's do it, brother.
Yeah. So I'm out here in California, and it's a tough story, man. This unit lost 2 Marines in the last 6 months, to suicide. And that's why they asked me to come out. And it's a very long story. It's a beautiful story. It's a complicated story. I shouldn't be here. And if I told you the real reason, my daughter's involved in the story, which is like, what? Your daughter's involved with some of the greatest fighters on planet Earth. Real fighters on planet Earth. Yeah, it's a long story. But I come out here, man, and I got to do this 90-minute keynote. We did a bunch of other stuff, which I'm still processing it. I can't even understand what just happened to me over the last 2 days after almost 15 years of doing this. But we come out here. One of the things that hit me was, I trained on a national championship team, tough guys, and we were tough on each other, almost to a hazing aspect with new guys that came in. And that happens with Marines. Like there's some tough stuff that happens that no one can talk about. Tough stuff happened to me. Until you made the team, you tried to ruin a freshman. And I didn't, but I watched it happen. And I think back on it, it's almost embarrassing that we treated humans like that. But that's what makes a national championship team.
Yeah.
But here's the beautiful contrast, man. I go to TriStar, where there are world champions. I never saw one guy be mean to another guy. I never saw one man disparage. Never saw one man do something hurtful. I never saw one man haze anybody. Now think about that deeply. You got a national ranked championship team that would brutalize each other sometimes. And there was a brotherhood. I get it, man. I get it. There's a tremendous amount of utility in teasing. Peter Gray writes about it. He's a researcher from Boston College. Brilliant. If you haven't read the book Free to Learn, it's brilliant. If you have your own kids, you should read it. But there's utility in teasing. You had a circle of kids when you were in high school that were your guys, right?
Yeah.
And there's one guy that got picked on in the group.
Yep.
And it's supposed to be that way. It's happened for thousands of years. You were making him stronger to a certain extent. So when he went out into the world, he could protect himself. And nobody else was allowed to pick on him, but you guys were tough on him, right?
Yeah.
I can tell you about the guy in my group that we picked on. I don't want to say his name because he might listen, but
Right.
we picked on him, but nobody else could. So you almost think that that's okay. And then you get into these groups and you almost take it too far. And, but I never saw that at TriStar. And when I came out to talk to these Marines and I got to the end of one of these things, I just said, you guys are tough on each other, mean to each other, hurtful to each other. There's this hazing, this brutalization that happens that you hear about, that you read about, and something happens and it makes the national news and it's like, oh, these monsters. But when you look, and they are the greatest force on planet Earth. This is the infantry in the U.S. Marine Corps. And the thing that washed over me that I passed on to them was this experience that I've never thought about until I got out here, that's not what makes the greatest fighters on planet Earth. What makes the greatest fighters on planet Earth is a brotherhood, a camaraderie, of compassion,
Mutual respect.
mutual respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what? I'll back that down a little bit. I would say dignity and the
Yeah.
value that they all bring to the table as humans. So I don't know, man. There's so much to talk. Anyway, I'll just wrap up the story real quick. So, I do the Ultimate Fighter show. I get involved with TriStar, blah, blah, blah. I don't really understand what's going to happen. I get done with the show. Friends of mine start calling me and they warn you about the show. You're going to hear from people you haven't talked to in 20 years. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Dude, it's crazy, the people that get a hold of you. But people were doing the right thing. Can you come talk to my volleyball team, my basketball team, my baseball? Yeah. And I've had some great coaches, been able to package up lessons on leadership, motivation, goal setting. Did that for a little bit here and there. A buddy of mine called me from college, said, hey, man, speaker I had lined up to do something on bullying fell through last minute. Can you do something? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'll throw you one. Another school saw it. I made up this silly little message called Sweethearts and Heroes, which is very purposeful, the name. And another school saw it. Jake, 2 million kids later, from Houston to Hawaii to Montreal and back. My speaking partner and I, a guy named Rick Yarish, you should have him on your show if you can.
I'd love to. I spent some time looking at his story.
Yeah,
And
dude.
holy smokes, man! It's
70% of his body was burned away.
Yeah.
And we've just taken this beautiful message and unlike anything you've ever seen in your life, I promise you. And in 2014, I quit my job. Was making 200,000+ bucks a year. Family scared the hell out of me.
Yeah.
Quit my job. Dedicated my life to this. But it really took me full circle, man, because the kids that I talk to are my brothers and sisters growing up. People that are hopeless. Feel like they have no options, except unfortunately to take themselves out of this world. And suicides in 10 to 14-year-olds, Jake, since 2007 have tripled. And maybe that's the worst of the destructive decisions. And I just gave my life to it, man. I'll land on this. I promise. I had a chance. I was just about ready to go back to the UFC. Had a couple wins outside because I kind of, jumped tracks on the side of the story, but Frost asked me, after the Jake O'Brien thing fell through, he said, take a year off and just work on your stand-up game. I said, okay. And I trusted him. And then, we got a hold of the UFC. They said, take a couple fights. We did, won them, was ready to go back. I was speaking so much to kids by then that I just said, I got to make a choice. You can either train full time at that level, or you can truly change the world. And I know that this message was changing the world, man. I saw it with my own eyes. So I went all in, man. That's what I've been doing.
That's a beautiful story, man. Thank you for just taking me. No. Thanks.
Yeah, man. I wasn't planning on that.
What was the origin story for Sweethearts and Heroes? And you gave me a hell of an origin story, brother. Like,
I never told it like that. So
that was wonderful, man. And thanks for all the pit stops along the way and some of those fun little side stories as you got into it. I'm 8 years into my Brazilian jiu-jitsu journey. I have recently come on over the last 5 or 6 years as an actual like UFC one championship, like Bellator fight fan. And it's really cool to hear somebody who was kind of in those really early days of at least the Ultimate Fighter and some of the 2005, 6, 7, like when were you doing some of these fights?
Yeah, something like that, man. It was that time frame.
That's wild. That's absolutely.
If you want, I can connect you to Rich too. He does his own podcast. You guys might I could feel you guys, the chemistry, you guys could do one together.
I'd love that. What an honor.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah, I will. So let's you brought up a pretty surprising stat to me, something I didn't understand. You said suicide rates are up for 10 to 14-year-olds, 3x. Is that the right statistic?
Yeah, man.
They get that. So I'm sure because you speak about this, you've probably done a lot of research and or talked to parents of folks who have done this or have contemplated this. What's going on? Is it technology? Is it a lack of empathy? Is it what are some of the factors that we're seeing that causes this? We have more connectivity than any other time, but a lot of times suicide, depression are associated with loneliness. What's going on, man?
Check.
Really?
You nailed a lot of them, Jake.
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell has this beautiful theory just about, in Outliers, he talks about plane crashes, and it's never one thing, man. The hole's got to line up on the Swiss cheese, right? It's never one thing. And, suicide's a big one we talk about. There's a lot of destructive decisions that young people are making that are elevated, that are on the rise. There's this crazy, the reason we're out here is there's this crazy parallel. It's almost eerie, the parallel between service members and young people. This one will blow your mind. 30,177 service members have taken their own lives post 9/11. You know how many died in combat, Jake? Post 9/11?
3 or 4,000?
7,057. I think you can quote me on that. So that's just
more than 4 times more.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Self-inflicted. Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
It's crazy.
You say why? And it's one of the things that Rick and I have spent a tremendous amount of time researching. You say, why? What's the reason? And when I have this parent, and when you look at kids and service members on this trajectory, there's only been one time in history when the service member suicide rate has outpaced the general population. That was during the Vietnam era. There's only been one other time, except for now. It's outpacing the general population, which doesn't really happen. I mean, we hear about the 22 a day, but that doesn't mean they're outpacing the general population. But now they are. And our children, which is the scariest thing to me. And we're not talking about it. Like, you didn't know that, and you have a kid that's almost ready to turn 10.
Yeah, that's true.
10 to 14-year-olds tripled the suicide rates. And that's maybe the worst of the destructive decisions. So you say, why? And we can go down this road of some of these holes that line up in this Swiss cheese. But the first thing that you got to understand, it's one word, because they feel hopeless. Right? And what's hope stand for, Jake? It stands for hold on, possibilities exist. HOPE. We have a generation of young people that don't feel like they can hold on to the possibilities that exist for their future, so they're willing to give up. It's the same reason why 22 service members end their own life every day in this country, because they feel hopeless. Did you take the time, Jake, to watch 13 Reasons?
I did not.
Yeah, well, a lot of parents will say to me, well, I don't even agree with that show. And I said, well, maybe I don't either, but I watched it because, I wanted to have common language with the young people I was talking to when it came out. But that show gets wrapped up into one word, because they feel hopeless. That's the why. There's no other reason why. That's what causes this destructive decision, this feeling of hopelessness. Now, think about that, man. In the most technologically advanced civilization Earth has ever known, right? And then the next question that people ask me, they say, well, what causes? It's why? What? What causes a young person? And I say it's the same thing that causes a service member. There's these common threads that weave between all of us, right? They connect every human on planet Earth. It's what it means to be human. Most people have never really thought about it. And when I say these things, you're going to be like, oh, yeah. But number one, outside of food, shelter, and water, what do we all need? Number one, some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose, some kind of significance. And when you think about this deeply, right? Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live can bear anyhow, right? He said, it's this sense of meaning, purpose that Viktor Frankl talked about, in Man's Search for Meaning. Right. And everybody's connected to this thing. We all have this great existential search for meaning, for purpose in our lives. Now, young people are in the midst of finding this meaning, right? When you were 13, 14, you got interested in something. I know your son's interested in lacrosse. That's starting to give him some meaning in life. Your daughter's interested in a little bit of dance, maybe some jujitsu. Before the age of 10, there's not much in meaning. You see the seeds of it. Before the age of 10, a kid needs one thing, and that's to belong. We'll talk about that in a second. But really, you got young people in the most technologically advanced civilization Earth has ever known, as I just said, that are desperate for meaning. Now, you think about what just happened to a lot of young people over that pandemic. When you were their age, you were just finding it. You got your first sport, you got your first instrument, you got your first job. That gives young people a sense of meaning. We stole it from them. We ripped it away from them for safety purposes, apparently, right?
Yeah.
You and I will never know how that feels to not be able to follow that same trajectory that human beings have followed for millions of years. And then you go deeper than that with meaning, Jake. It was G.K. Chesterton, the great journalist, British journalist, maybe arguably the greatest outside of Muggeridge, right? He said, meaninglessness does not come from the exhaustion of pain. Meaninglessness comes from the exhaustion of pleasure. You think about that with your own kids. We have inundated our children with so much pleasure. We've filled that, everything they've ever wanted, everything they ever need, everything they could ever imagine, see. We've annihilated imagination with kids because they don't need it anymore, right? They don't need imagination anymore. All they need is this. And they think this will blow your mind, Jake. Check this one out. You want one thing for your kids: to be
loved,
happy, loved, happy, right? Yeah. Most parents will say loved. I agree with you, but they'll say, I want my kid to be happy. You put Jean Twangy, if you haven't read iGen, you got young kids, it should be a mandatory reader on your list. She's a professor at Stanford.
It is now.
Okay, good.
That's why we're here, brother.
So listen, this right here, check this this statistic out. This thing right here, phone. When you put it into a human being's hand, not a kid, a human being, you will cut their happiness score in half. And every parent gets their kid a phone for one reason: to be happy, right? Oh, they're going to be happy. You just cut their happiness score in half. But you love them, right? You want them to be happy. So when you said, is it technology? There's one great reason. But it's not really the content that I talk about. I mean, I'll talk a lot about content. I got a friend of mine that wrote a book called Disconnected. He's been on Fox News and some other stuff. Kirsten, talked to him a couple times. And, parents always say to me, when's the right time to get a kid a phone? You know what he says? When you're ready for your kid to watch hardcore pornography, get him a phone. And then he pauses. Like, you think your 10-year-old, you have eyeballs on what they're doing. You have no clue. The pornography industry has inundated them at a very early age through cartoons. And you think you can manage it. You can't. And that shocks parents, but that's not really even the real problem. The real problem is neurologically what you're doing to them when they cannot fulfill that chasm of meaning in their life because they think it's about pleasure, but it's not. Meaninglessness, Viktor Frankl said, the greatest meaning in life comes from the attitude that you take towards the unavoidable suffering that you go through. It's got nothing to do with the stuff that you have, the stuff that you build, the stuff that you get. Meaning doesn't come from that. I learned that from my buddy Rick that got blown to hell. It said that the best thing that ever happened to him was getting blown to hell. The greatest suffering you can imagine. So that's the one thing, Jake, that we need to really focus on with our kids is they have very little meaning in their lives. And we think we're given a meaning with all this stuff, but we're not.
Okay.
So the other thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'll put a pin in my question, but like,
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask for an alternative path. Right. So maybe if we could come back to that as far
as I'll land this real quick. I keep saying I'll do that. But the other great thing, the other great thread that connects you, me, everybody in this hotel, everybody on that Marine Corps base, everybody, it's human acceptance. Yeah. It's that sense of belonging. And you know this. But what a lot of people don't understand is that young people are just pack animals, right? I've been in front of 2 million kids. I can walk into any school in the world and I can just watch the packs happen, the different intergroups. And most people, and there's this lady named Judith Rich Harris. She died about the age 80. They kicked her out of Harvard because she was going down this path. And this is going to rock you, Jake, right here. And I get in giant arguments with people all the time. I never really talked about this on a podcast or show before, but I talk about this stuff with parents all the time and teachers. Now, there's a huge, huge discussion right now about SEL, social emotional learning. And there's some people that think it's the devil, it's a Trojan horse, we're slipping in all this diversity, equity, inclusion, this transformative stuff. And I love that conversation. That's a deep, long conversation. I prescribe to a brand of SEL that started with James Comer in the 1960s, Yale Medical School. But this lady, Judith Rich Harris, now just follow me on this. She said this, they kicked her out of Harvard for this. It was crazy. She said, kids learn things in 4 ways. 4. 1, what their parents teach them. And this is what the one faction of the people that fight against SEL say. They say, that's not a school's job to teach that stuff. That's the parents' job. Okay. And that's the sword that they die on. I'm going to change your mind about something right now, Jake. Yeah. Because you're going to fall into that trap and you're going to say, yeah, it's my job to teach my kids. Number 2, what they see their parents model. And then parents are like, oh, shoot, that's right. That's actually more important than what I teach my kids. It's what they see me do. And I can give you a big, long discussion on that. And there's parts of that I buy with all my heart and soul. Number 3, what they see modeled from other adults. That's number 3. Number 4, the last one, their peer network. The first 3, you can pretty much just throw in the garbage. And that's when you get in a fight with a parent. No, I teach my kids. Okay. Answer me this right now, Jake. You ready?
Yeah.
An immigrant family moves into your community. They speak no English, have a very thick accent. They have a baby. Why does it grow up with no accent?
Because it's not being raised in an environment where
Jake, you just told me, I know you didn't, but you just told me that you had the greatest influence on your kids. Why don't you have an influence on the phonemes that they put together? All they did for the first 7, 8 years of your life is heard you talk, mostly. Why don't they got no accent? You're the greatest influence on their life, Jake. Maybe you should have taught them how to talk with an accent. Maybe you modeled that behavior with them. How come they don't have an accent? Here's a better one. Watch this. She talks about this. This is brilliant. They look at high society English young men that are exact duplicates, replicas of their fathers. You watch the way they walk, their enunciation, their pronunciation, their posture, everything. It's a replica of their fathers, right? And they're like, oh, shoot, they just model their fathers. They're raised by nannies for the first 7 years of their lives. They never even see their dads. Then they get shipped off to boarding school. Maybe they see their dads 2 weeks a year. Okay? So they say, oh, the school teaches them how to be that way, to be copies of their fathers. They're created at these same schools that their fathers went to. So they go to these schools and they investigate it, right? It's not the school. The little peer networks, these little boys, They know how upper society men act. They demand it of each other. No, this is how we're supposed to walk. This is how we're supposed to talk. They don't consciously do it, but they hold each other accountable and they force each other to. Now, after she died, Judith Rich Harris, a guy named Russell Barkley, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You got to watch this thing. He talks about shepherding versus engineering. And I'll land on this, I promise. He says I'm just going by memory here, man. I've just read this a couple times. He says from 0 to like 7 or 8.
Sure.
Maybe you got some kind of opportunity to influence your kids, but not really. I mean, Peter Gray says the age of independence for a human mammal is 4. That's the age of independence. And a kid must be socialized before the age of 5 by other children, or the kid is screwed. Like, it needs to be socialized. And that's a huge conversation. But once from about the age of 7 to about 15, your influence on your kid is like this. After the age of 15, this guy, Russell Barkley, says only about 6% of what you do, Jake, will actually influence the trajectory of your child's life. Only 6% after the age of 15. Once they hit 21, it's 0. Now, think deeply about that, because parents want to fight you on this. But when you were 15, were you listening to your parents?
What's that?
When you were 15, were you listening to your parents?
I heard what they said, but
but what were you doing, Jake?
well, it's kind of doing what
Whatever
I
the
wanted
hell
to
your
do.
buddies were doing. Whatever your buddies were doing. And this is fascinating because I just finished Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. It's about the trans movement. You should learn about that. It's fascinating. And she says the same thing that Judith Rich Harris said 20 years ago. The only influence that you will have, and Russell Barkley says this, and I promise I'll land on this one. The only influence you will ever have on your kid is the environment that you put them in. That's it. Because that environment will shape them. Now, I'm not saying your kids won't get some great lessons and come back to you. It's neat watching my own kids come back to me now at 21, 22, 23, 25, and being like, yeah, man, you were right about that, Dad. Can you tell me more about that? I'm like, yeah, sure. I tried telling you this for years.
Yeah, it's time to double click in my 20s.
Yeah. So anyway, man, but so when you say why and what, it's really this great need, man, for meaning, purpose, and human acceptance.
So let's talk about this then, because I kind of find those 2 points that you just put out in conflict, meaning belonging, especially with kids these days. And I hear it from my son already. There's kids with phones. There's kids, they're not necessarily active on social, but they participate in these different apps, participate in these different games, all these like online internet things where they're, cursing at each other and, whatever they're doing, playing these games. There's a sense of belonging in that. And that's in direct conflict with kind of that other side of like, you lean into that, you put the phone in their hand, as you were talking about earlier, and then all of a sudden now you've cut their happiness down trying to help them belong. And so like what's that trade-off like, and what are some of these conversations that you're advising parents on in order to mitigate those two those juxtaposed positions?
It is, man. It's fascinating, Jake. And there's way too much to say about this for a podcast.
Sure.
It's something that parents should spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, learning about. I mean, I'm not avoiding your question. I think it's really brilliant thought you've got, because they kind of oppose each other, because I got so many thoughts and comments on this, man. It's fascinating, man.
Yeah.
And when I look back on my own saga with my own children, I got one in the Air Force. She changed the engines on F-35 fighter jets, but I was smart enough because someone hit me in the head when I was younger. My son Thomas is 19 today. And it's funny, man. And I was so blessed to get this lesson. I put him in wrestling, and he, at the age of 5 or 6, he bit a kid, punched a kid. He's just a little guy. And I remember calling my buddy who gave me some great advice. And I didn't know what to do. He's a wrestling coach and he does youth wrestling. And I'm like, dude, I don't know what to do. What do I do? Like the kid loves coming to practice with me, but I don't, it's the way. And I went on and on and on. And he said, stop. He said, what did you just say? He loves coming to practice with me. And he said, stop. You went too far. He loves being with you, Tom. He's not a wrestler. You're making him become a wrestler. He's not a wrestler. And I was like, no. He said, Tom, that's your significance. And dads are really good at this, Jake. And it's very, very dangerous because we assign our significance because you want your kid to feel the same joy and the same elation and the same sense of meaning and belonging and purpose that you get from what makes you you. But Russell Barkley says this. He said, your kids are a beautiful mosaic of your extended family, not of you. Get over it. He says you're born with over 400 different personality traits that emerge as you continue to grow. And your job as a father is to shepherd them. Your job as a father is not to engineer them. This is some of his stuff. But I had to learn that. That day I told my son, you don't have to wrestle another match. And he loved going with me, played the games and still wrestled a little bit. But Thomas got into fencing. He loves to skeet shoot. He got into skeet shooting. He got into swimming. Now he's into strongman at 19. And that's the love of his life. He started taking himself to the gym with a guy from the military, probably because I was hanging around with Rick at that time. He got up at 6 o'clock in the morning before he had to do his schoolwork. And for years, he went to the gym at the age of 12, 13 with this 25-year-old man who was a freaking monster because that's what he wanted to do. So, we can talk about the problems. And my buddy built Wingman Connect for the U.S. Air Force. And one of the things we do is we say the deficit and then we live in it. What's the problem? We got to do that. But once you say the deficit, you got to reframe it and then come from a place of strength. And you got to identify that's the first thing I asked you. What are your kids into, Jake?
Yeah.
Because dads are really awful creatures, right? Because they want to, you got to do this, buddy. You got to do this. I was standing with a dad once and I told somebody out here this story. I was standing with a dad once and, I was talking to him and I turned to his daughter. She must've been 13, 14. And I said, what do you want to do? She goes, I want to cut hair. And this dad right in front of me says, well, you can do better than that, sweetie. And I turned to him and I said, bro, I got a buddy of mine that I was gentle. I said, I got a buddy of mine that makes millions of dollars cutting hair. The guy's got like 15 salons. And I said, you mean she's too good for that? And he's like, no, that's not what I meant. I said, but that's what you're telling the poor thing.
Yeah.
I said, she's got to start with a chair and one seat. I said, you're a business guy. Why don't you help her grow that significance, that meaning, that purpose? And there's some of the great research that I love is around self-determination theory, right? And there's a sub-theory underneath it called basic psychological needs, BPNT. A guy named Edward Deci and Richard Ryan came up with this theory. And you should know this as a father. Basic psychological needs, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of motivational needs, but this is a little different. He says every human being needs like 3 things, right? And this is important to answer your question. Number 1, they need autonomy. And we've ripped that away from kids. Jonathan Haidt writes about this in Coddling of the American Mind. That's another great book that every parent should have to read. But they need autonomy, and we've stripped them of autonomy, right? Autonomy leads to number 2 on that basic psychological need, which is competence. All you want for your kids is to be competent at whatever they do, but they can't be competent if you're not letting them be autonomous. Right. It's crazy. And the third piece is relatedness. And that's really comes full circle back to making sure they get into these environments where they're with other people that are on the same life trajectory that they want to be on. Because the danger is this, Jake. When I was a kid, the pothead group would take you in. They'd take anybody in. If you brought a little bit of weed and some money, you could join our group. Come on. We want to be mean to you.
Right.
But with this thing, man, there's so many groups out there that kids can gravitate to that will accept them. And that need for belonging might just trump everything. It might trump everything. I said from 0 to 10, a kid needs one thing, and that's to belong. And then they go on this search for meaning. But in this struggle for meaning, because we think it's about pleasure, but it's not. And because we've given them all this pleasure, the only thing they have to revert back to is this sense of belonging. And they get sucked into this vortex of different groups that'll take anybody in. And the scary thing is they don't even know the groups. Abigail Shrier talks about this in that book, Irreversible Damage. The trans, and I'm not anti-trans at all. I talk to trans kids every day. They're human beings that need to be loved and supported. And I'm no scientist. I'm no doctor. I don't know anything about this stuff. So I'm not, fighting this. But the funny thing is there's been 1,000% increase. In Europe, it's over 4,000%. And a lot of what they trace it back to is these kids that are struggling with meaning, purpose, belonging, and they find these groups that just create these echo chambers and these closed networks. And they just fulfill this deep sense of belonging and hunger. You walk into an auditorium with 1,000 kids, there's little pockets of kids snuggling with each other, arms around each other, their heads on each other's laps. That's what pack animals are supposed to do.
Yeah.
That becomes the most important thing to a kid is their friends, even more important than their own families. So it's a really interesting conversation, Jake, and the juxtaposition that you're talking about and the conflict between meaning and acceptance. But really, man, I believe with all my heart with this Judith Rich Harris and this other stuff that acceptance trumps everything.
We have talked for 50 minutes already. And
I wasn't planning on talking about any of this.
I know, brother. Listen, I want to make sure, I do have to wrap. I have a commitment that I have to go to. I wish I would have blocked out more time for this. I want to invite you back too. Oh my God, you're the amount of knowledge that you dropped. I have to listen to this podcast probably multiple times to get all the book references, quotations, some of those things. And I encourage everybody to go back. The last 20 minutes is absolutely fire as far as if you're a parent.
Can I tell you one more thing, Jake? I don't want to cut you up, but I want to give you this gift.
Please.
You got to read Play, Play by Stuart Brown. It's one of my favorite books. Just understand this. I'm just giving you this because your own children. Stuart Brown says that everything a mammal learns to transition successfully from childhood into adulthood, they learn in one place and one place only, in self-directed, self-controlled play. We have annihilated play in children, self-directed, self-controlled play. We don't let them do it anymore. We've stripped them of that autonomy, and we don't let them do it. If you want your kids to be joyful and happy, you need to understand their individual play personality. I'm only breaking this off, man, because of those two beautiful humans that you have the privilege of shepherding. They will emerge with a play personality. There's multiple ones. And Stuart Brown talks about the collectors. You probably know some collectors in your life, collect football helmets, or there's explorers, people that love to travel or go out in the woods. There's directors, that just like the kids are like, hey, but we're going to play this game and you do this and that. So you need to understand your kids' play personality. Now, just understand this one last thing. If you can take a play personality and watch your children's play history, and you can help foster the environments around that as they continue to get older. When you tie your play personality and your play history to your adult life, you will always find joy. And that's hard because you're going to want to say, oh man, you can't do that the rest of your life. Yes, you can. It's engineering. Those kids that play with Legos like nutballs, they make great engineers. So you need to study this book. You need to study your kids' play personality. You need to study their play history as it's continuing to emerge, and not what you want it to be, Jake, what it truly is that's programmed into them. Like I was programmed to wrestle. If you can do that, your kids will always find joy. If I go into a room of teachers, 100 teachers, and I say, who played teacher growing up? 75% of them will put their hands up. You know what the other ones are doing? 10 years, 6 days, 3 hours, and 15 seconds left. And I'm always like, You never played teacher growing up, did you? Nope. I just settled for a job. So please, man, make sure you let your kids play. There's nothing more important than mammal than play. Every mammal has a play cycle that they go through. Rats will play from 4 weeks to 14 weeks and then they stop. That defines their entire life. If you disrupt it, they don't even know how to mate properly. So I could talk for days about play, but please, 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 those beautiful creatures you have at home, make sure you know their play personality or the versions of it. Make sure you foster their play history, and you help them tie that to their adolescence, their adult life, and the relatedness of the people and the environments that they're in that will foster and grow that, because then they will be happy human beings.
Tom Murphy.
That's
The mic drop there at the end, man. Thank you so much. I am immediately getting on play and reflecting. And there's probably, I think my son is a director, and I think I could be interfering with an optimal environment for him as a result of, maybe my feelings in the way that he's directing. And maybe I'm taking that away from him in that space. So a lot of self-reflection going on here, as you were saying that, Tom, not
a
lost
wise
on me
man,
at
Jake.
all.
A wise man.
A couple things here. Sweethearts and Heroes is an organization that you are running, impacting lives. And what's the easiest way for people to find you? Website, social?
Sweetheartsandheroes.com, social media. It's everywhere.
Wonderful. We didn't talk about the fact that you're an entrepreneur, restaurateur, doing some really cool things in that space as well. But I encourage folks to look up Tom. All the links will be in the show notes. Go check out his ecosystem, things that he's doing. Maybe invite him and his team to come and speak at schools, organizations that you're a part of. Sounds like he's doing it a lot. As well. So, Tom, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you spending it with me today. And enjoy your California experience out there. It sounds like some impacted lives are happening, and look forward to having you on the show in the future.
Thanks, man. I work 24/7, Jake. If you ever need anything, but the most important work you'll do is with those two beautiful, well, and your wife. She's got to be more important than your kids. Don't ever forget that. I'll talk to you about
I don't, man. Thank you, Tom. Have a wonderful day.
you, brother.